So we got to page 182, or top of 183. Um, and, and so we're continuing with state 7, God in a state of spiritually advanced souls. So I'll just segue, the one paragraph. The enchantment on the spiritual path is so great and the enticement so intense that even in the earlier stages of the journey, the pilgrim has a pseudo sense of God realization from which he cannot emerge unless helped by perfect masters. Many an advanced pilgrim in the subtle sphere thinks that he has gained complete freedom from births and deaths, although this is not so. The delusion remains up to the 6th plane of involving consciousness, but it is most conspicuous between the 3rd and 4th planes. The 4th plane of consciousness is the most treacherous stage in the pilgrim's progress, because this is the stage when all the powers of the infinite energy of the subtle sphere are under his direct command. The misuse of these powers means the downfall and disintegration of the consciousness of the soul. Though it is a fundamental fact that once consciousness is gained, it can never be lost, yet an exception to this rule can occur, but only at the 4th plane, where there is a good possibility of the consciousness gained by the soul being disintegrated. While it is never lost completely, it disintegrates as far back as the consciousness of the stone form. The whole process of evolution of consciousness then has to be repeated to regain the full consciousness and the human form. Thus it is that from the 4th plane, the pilgrim on the spiritual path may either fall back due to the abuse or wrong use of tajalliyat, that is siddhis, or progress by further involution of his consciousness to 5th plane consciousness and capture the experience of the mental sphere or the mental world. Crossing the 4th plane and stepping into the 5th would mean gaining approach to the divine gate. In the 6th plane, the pilgrim, quote, sees, unquote, God face to face. This seeing is through the mental eye when the consciousness of the soul identifies the soul with the mental body. Even when the pilgrim sees God face to face in the 6th plane of his involving consciousness, the grip of duality is not overcome, because the seer and the seen are still differentiated through the seeing. Imagination on the plains ceases as soon as the pilgrim crosses the field of illusion and enters the realm of reality in the 7th plane of completely involved consciousness, where he is absolutely free of all traces of impressions. The seventh plane consciousness is full as well as mature and is the impressionless consciousness which identifies the soul with its self. The soul then feels and experiences consciously its eternal existence as God. The drop soul, devoid of any bubble or form of ignorance in illusion, realizes its eternal existence in the infinite ocean as the ocean itself, the Paramatma or the Oversoul. Ernie, please.
State 8. God as a divinely absorbed. This state of God signifies for the soul the end of the long evolutionary struggle, the end of the reincarnation process, and the end of the realization process through the planes. For the individual soul, there is no higher stage toward which to aspire, because it has reached the soul by becoming one with God. The God realized pilgrim of this stage is known to the Sufi world as Mazub, and the Vedantists calls him a Brahmi Bhut. The Mazub has no body consciousness and no consciousness of the three spheres, the gross, the subtle, and the mental. This means that in this state, 8, God is Mazub, consciously experiences his own infinite trio nature of infinite power, knowledge, and bliss, but does not make use of these infinite aspects of his nature. In this state 8, the unconscious infinite state A of God, the unconscious Paramatma, not only gains the highest divine consciousness of state B of God, the conscious Paramatma, but in this state, God becomes divinely absorbed in the reality of his own infinite conscious state, and thus realizes his eternal identity with the infinite conscious state B of God. This state 8 of God is of the highest divine consciousness, which is the Ahad Ayat Halut-e Muhammadai, or the Vidnyan. All God realized beings, the Mazub-e Kamil, Rami Bahut, Mazub Salik, Paramhansa, Asad-e Mutlak, Jivan Mukta, Qutub, Sadguru, and Rasul, Avatar, retire to this state B of God in the beyond after disembodiment. Mayor Baba explained that such a disembodied state of the perfect master is referred to by the Sufis as Halat-e Muhammadi, state of Muhammad, as distinguished from Maqam-e Muhammadai, office of Muhammad. When in a physical body, Hajjat-e Muhammadai is the 10th state of God in a physical body, and the Majun-e Muhammadai, office of Muhammad, is the Vinyan Bhumukai, the office of Vinyan, depicted in the chart as C. State 9, God is liberated incarnate soul. If God, divinely absorbed as in state 8, recovers and maintains normal consciousness of the mental, subtle, and gross spheres through his mental, subtle, and gross aspects as an embodiment of a perfect human being known as Mazub, divinely absorbed, he then experiences state 9 at the divine junction between God states 9 and 10, or 8 and 10. If the soul recovers the normal consciousness of the mental, subtle, and gross bodies and spheres, it comes out as of the Mazub state 8, crossing the Fana Thila to get the experience of the Baka Bila state. But before becoming established in Baka Bila, it may enter the state known to Sufis as Fana Ma al Baka of the Makam e Fruatat, which the Vedantas call Turiya Avasta. This is state 9 at the divine junction between the Fana Thila and Baka Bila of divinity. The God realized souls in a human body at this state are either the Paramhansa Mazub Salik or Salik Mazub, or the Jivan Mukta Azad e Mutlak. They both enjoy infinite knowledge, power, and bliss, and are conscious of the I am God state. They differ from the Mazubi Kamil, however, in that they can and do become conscious of the three bodies and the three spheres, mental, subtle, and gross. While the Mazub state is a continual state of being divinely absorbed, the state of the Paramhansa is one of sometimes being divinely absorbed and sometimes recovering normal consciousness of one who experiences the Saluk of Sulikayat. His conscious experience is sometimes that of I am my own God, and sometimes I am my own creature. The state of the Jivan Mukta is of one who normally experiences the Saluk of Salukayat, that is, of one permanently established in the state of Baka Bila. Both the Paramhansa and Jivan Mukta differ from the Qutub in not being able to use the infinite knowledge, power, and bliss that they experience continuously. No direct spiritual benefit accrues to the world from a Paramhansa, a Jivan Mukta. And the asterisk is, nevertheless, indirectly, anyone coming in contact with him automatically benefits. However, a Jivan Mukta, towards the end of his life, does make one single soul perfect like himself, although he has no duty in the three spheres. He enjoys the Baka Bila state. State 10. God is man God and God man. This is a state of God in a human body, such as a perfect master, Qutub, Sadguru. In this state, the perfect master, or the man God, is divinely, unattachedly, and unlimitedly above the law of illusion that governs the cosmic creation in an infinitely systematical order. And yet he permits himself to be bound by the limitations of time, space, and causation, while continually experiencing consciously his I am God state and his infinite power, knowledge, and bliss. He not only experiences these infinite attributes, but he also uses these for the emancipation of other souls in the grip of ignorance, who are still unconscious of their own eternal reality. This is the state of absolute perfection. Here, God is with attributes and with form, saguna and sakar. According to the Sufis, the Qutub connotes the highest point on the upward journey. He is the summum bonum of creation and the fairest flower of humanity. In the Mazub state, the soul enjoyed the infinite bliss of the I am God state. But the perfect master, Qutub Sadguru, enjoys the infinite bliss of the I am God state, and also the highest divine consciousness of everything is I, and everything is from me. This 10th state of God in the human body is the state of Jat-e-Mohammadi. The perfect masters, Qutubs or Sadgurus, and the avatar, Rasul, are all of this state. Whether God is in the state of man God, as perfect master, or in the state of God man, as avatar, he is in this 10th state and functions as a man God and as a God man from the divine office, Maqam-e-Muhammadi, or Vidyan Bhumukai, depicted in the chart SC. The first manifestation of God with infinite consciousness assumed this divine office, and this office will ever continue to function eternally to radiate infinite power, knowledge, and bliss, which the perfect masters and the avatar not only eternally experience, but also use for the emancipation of all souls who are still in the grip of ignorance, trying to gain consciousness of their eternal state of oneness with the oversoul.
Thanks, Ernie. I'll take a turn reading. In other words, God in a human body will everlastingly manifest himself in all of his perfection only through this divine office marked C in the chart, the 10 states of God. It was only through this divine office that God, as God-man, in the form of Zoroaster, Rama, Krishna, Jesus, Buddha, Muhammad, and others, manifested himself and proclaimed in every cycle, age after age, that he is the Savior, the Prophet, the Messiah, the Son of God, the Avatar, the Rasul, the Buddha, and so forth. And it is only through this divine office that the 5 perfect masters, or the Kutubs, or the Sadgurus function as the summum bonum of the whole cosmic creation. The Sufis call this divine office Muqam-e-Muhammadi, after the name of the Prophet Muhammad, the Rasul of God, in his Hakikat-e-Muhammadi. Similarly, Jesus of Nazareth, the Son of God, is, like Muhammad, Zoroaster, Krishna, Rama, Buddha, the God-man, whilst Christ, like Hakikat-e-Muhammadi, is the divine state of Jesus. When we try to put together all the different stages of God in a nutshell, 5 distinct stages in the travail of the unconscious Paramatma to gain complete consciousness become conspicuous. The first stage, 1. To begin with, Atma or soul and Paramatma, oversoul, are both one in the infinite, indivisible oneness of reality. 2. Before the beginning of the beginning, Paramatma and all Atmas were unconscious and unimpressioned. 3. In the beginning, Atma had no consciousness of the gross body, subtle body, or mental body, and therefore had no experience of the gross world, the subtle world, or the mental world. Atma was even unconscious of its own self, and therefore had no experience of its own Paramatma state. This is the stage depicted as state A in the chart of the 10 states of God. The second stage, Atma gains consciousness and has impressions. At this stage, Atma is conscious either of the gross body or the subtle body or the mental body, and experiences either the gross world or the subtle world or the mental world. But Atma is still unconscious of its own self and therefore does not experience the Paramatma state yet. This is the stage as in states 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7, according to the chart. The third stage, Atma becomes impressionless, but retains full and complete consciousness. This complete consciousness is now no longer of the gross body, the subtle body, or the mental body, and therefore Atma no longer experiences the gross world, the subtle world, or the mental world. This consciousness that is retained is of Atma's own infinite self, and therefore Atma now experiences the Paramatma state consciously and experiences the infinite power, knowledge, and bliss of the I am God state. This is the stage noted as state 8 in the chart. The fourth stage, Atma recovers the so-called normal consciousness of the gross body, the subtle body, and the mental body, and therefore once again experiences at one and the same time the gross world, the subtle world, and the mental world. At this stage, Atma is simultaneously also conscious of its own infinite self and experiences the infinite power, infinite knowledge, and infinite bliss of its own Paramatma state. But Atma cannot use these infinite attributes. even though at this stage it is conscious of its gross, subtle, and mental bodies and experiences simultaneously the three worlds. This is the stage of state 9 in the chart. The fifth stage, Atma is fully and completely conscious of the gross body, the subtle body, and the mental body, and experiences the gross world, the subtle world, and the mental world simultaneously, with having the highest divine consciousness of its infinite self, and also experiences and uses the infinite power, infinite knowledge, and infinite bliss of its own Paramatma state. This is the stage of state 10 as shown in the chart of the 10 states of God. Asterisks reads, a summary by Meher Baba of different terms for status, state, stage, or aspect, and gnosis in the eternal sphere of reality appears on pages 278, 279. The gnosis of I am God is common to each one of the four types of perfection and does not end on physical death. Part 10, conclusion. God cannot be explained. He cannot be argued about. He cannot be theorized, nor can he be discussed and understood. God can only be lived. Nevertheless, all that is said here and explained about God to appease the intellectual convulsions of the mind of man still lacks many more words and further explanations, because the truth is that the reality must be realized and the divinity of God must be attained and lived. To understand the infinite eternal reality is not the goal of individualized beings in the illusion of creation, because the reality can never be understood. It is to be realized by conscious experience. Therefore, the goal is to realize the reality and attain the I am God state in human form. Then we have the beautiful painting. And Ernie, could you continue reading the explanation of that painting?
Chart 8A, creation, evolution, reincarnation, involution, and realization, according to Meher Baba. This chart, painted by Reno Gailey under the supervision of Meher Baba, is a pictorial version of the book God Speaks. God in the beyond state represents God as pure essence, infinite, original, and eternal, unaware of anything, even of himself. God is. God in the beyond state represents the oversoul, Paramatma, essentially the same as God in the beyond state. except that here surged the whim to know himself, and he became conscious of infinite power, knowledge, and bliss, and simultaneously conscious of illusion, which manifested as the creation. By completing his journey through the worlds of forms, he sheds the illusion of their apparent reality. Reading counterclockwise, the first forms taken by souls emanating from the creation point are gaseous. As consciousness evolves, souls take the innumerable forms indicated, experiencing increasing impressions, sanskaras. Arriving at the state of man, the soul has achieved complete consciousness and reincarnates innumerable times until it is ready to experience involution, all of which takes place while embodied in the gross world. While getting free of sanskaras, the ascending soul gradually becomes aware of the seven planes and higher spheres until it is liberated from all bindings and becomes one with God, God realized. The first three planes depict subtle awareness. The fourth portrays the vast powers and energies encountered there. The fifth is the plane of sainthood and is in the mental sphere. The sixth is the plane of illumination. And the seventh is the plane of God realization, that is, unity with God.
Then we have the contents page of the supplement. We'll go on to the supplement itself.
One, impression consciousness. 27. At the request of the editors, Meher Baba added the following information. Consciousness is definitely complete as soon as the first human form is taken, but it does not start involving at that point. When consciousness first begins to involve, it means that the human being is only beginning to take the first step on the spiritual path. Between the time of the first human incarnation and the time of going on the path, the complete consciousness of a human being, which is still an impression consciousness, has necessarily to indulge in a process that eventually must dislodge these impressions from retaining their hold on it, the consciousness which is complete. It is to be noted that during that period, which covers thousands of reincarnations, the impressions which were hard set or dense get shaken up so thoroughly by the reincarnation process that their tight grip on consciousness becomes loose. These hard set, dense or gross impressions thin out or become feeble through innumerable and varied experiences of opposites. The limit to these experiences is reached by persistent reincarnations, which give experiences of opposites. It is also to be noted that it is only when these dense, hard set, or gross impressions become less dense or become feeble that the limit to the experiences of the gross world through gross impressions is reached by the gross medium, the human body. When the dense, hard set impressions become less dense, they no longer give rise to gross experiences because these less dense, feeble impressions are refined or fine and no longer crude or gross. And the asterisk says parenthetical numbers refer to the page number of this book where the supplement reference appears. The aggregate of such refined or fine impressions is called subtle impressions. These subtle impressions give rise to experiences of the subtle type, that is, pertaining to the subtle world. And the subtle body experiences these subtle impressions and tries to exhaust them. When these subtle impressions become even less dense and still more refined, the aggregate of such impressions is called mental impressions. These mental impressions give rise to experiences pertaining to the mental world. And the mental body experiences these mental impressions and tries to exhaust them. When the last traces of mental impressions are exhausted through experiences of the mental body, the complete consciousness of the soul, which was all along in the grip of impressions from the instant it identified itself with the most first human form up to the last human form, which is a mental conscious human being, is unburdened of impressions. Only such impressionless complete consciousness can realize the final experience of the I am God state of the soul. When the gross or hard set impressions get thinned out by the reincarnation process, they become subtle impressions. These subtle impressions can no longer give rise to experiences of the gross world. At this stage, the consciousness of the gross conscious human being automatically begins to indulge in experiences of the subtle world. This marks the advent of the process of involution of consciousness, and the aspirant begins to tread the path. It is obvious that the subtle impressions must give rise to the subtle experiences of the subtle world. These subtle impressions get exhausted by the subtle body through experiences of the subtle world, and the process of involution of consciousness continues. Two, practical mysticism, 41.
So
Approach to truth.
can I just interject? 41 refers back to page 41 of it's part 5, the planes, and the sentence reads, when the consciousness of the soul is ripe for disentanglement from the gross world, it enters the spiritual path and turns inwards. Go ahead, Ernie. Thanks.
Okay. Approach to truth is individual. There is no general rule or method applicable to all who aspire to realize God. Every man must work out his own salvation and must realize his own method, although his choice is mostly determined by the total effect of the mind impressions, sanskaras. Acquired in previous lives. He should be guided by the creed of his conscience and follow the method that best suits his spiritual tendency, his physical aptitude, and his external circumstances. Truth is one, but the approach to it is essentially individual. The Sufis say there are as many ways to God as there are souls of men. Of Varuk, Ilahani, Kanus, Husi, Banu Adam, Jamal E. Fivrat, Kailat, parteo, Kabul, parteo, hilak, shakik, tariq, herfak, mak, Thea, Batush, Ya, Ron, Kinsky, Wan, Ron, Kishki. That is by Akbar. In English, nature's beauty has thousands of facets for which there are thousands of ways and means of acceptance, understanding, in the path of gnosis. Who can determine which particular mode or mood is earmarked for a given individual? Renunciation. When a pilgrim, and by pilgrim we mean here aspirate or disciple, feels drawn to renunciation, it means that the spirit of renunciation was already latent in him. This readiness results from the swinging of the terrible pendulum from pain to pleasure and pleasure to pain, in the countless forms of evolution and in the countless entrances and exits through the doors of birth and death experienced during reincarnation. Because the spirit of renunciation is latent, it needs only some exciting cause to bring it to the surface. And it is only when it comes to the surface that we are able to see the power and nature of the latent spirit. If the latent spirit is simply a spiritual indigestion from a temporary surfeit of pain, combined with a mild desire for something more pleasant, the overt renunciation will be only of a fleeting and feeble kind, a mere temporary escape from unpleasantness. At its best, however, this latent spirit is a secret pact of aggression between an incurable disgust for the world and an ardent and burning thirst for God. When it comes to the surface, it shows itself as an invincible determination to marshal the entire being to the attainment of victory over the lower self, and to reject everything that is irrelevant to this great and terrible struggle. Note this word reject. It means that such a pilgrim casts aside irrelevancies. We might call renunciation the fruit of the flower of spiritual longing, fertilized by the pollen of disgust for the futility of endless births and deaths. Once renunciation expresses itself, there are many ways of looking at it, of which the simplest is to divide it into two main types: internal and external.
Thank you, Ernie. I do beg your pardon, Marianne. I didn't see you come in. Um, I, my view was of just a single speaker. So please continue for us.
Oh, all right. Thank you. External renunciation means giving up completely all worldly delights and physical attachments to material things. In the early stages, this renunciation is helpful to the extent to which it leads to internal renunciation and preoccupation with God. Tens of thousands of so-called sannyasis, renunciators, are to be found in India, of whom far too many have adopted this external renunciation only as a profession that enables them to indulge in an unproductive life of idleness. External renunciation, however, can be and often is real. When this is so, it will inevitably lead on to internal renunciation. And this is the renunciation that matters. Internal renunciation means the control of desires at their very source, so that the mind does not fall a prey to the demands of lust, greed, and anger. This does not mean that one shall cease at once to have such thoughts. This is impossible, as such thoughts will continue to be troublesome as long as the sanskaras from which they arise are part of one's being. The fight is necessarily hard and long. For the West in particular, external renunciation is inadvisable and impractical. It should be internal and of the mind from the start. One should live in the world, perform all legitimate duties, and yet feel mentally detached from everything. One should be in the world, but not of it. The Sufis say, Dilba yar dast bikar. The heart with God, the hands for work. Hazrat Nizamuddin Awliya, the perfect master of Delhi, was once asked by a visitor how one should live in the world. At that moment, it so happened that a few women were passing by with pitchers of water balanced on their heads. And as they walked, they gossiped and gesticulated. Pointing to them, Nizamuddin said, "Look at those women. That's how you should live in the world." Asked to explain this cryptic remark, the master continued, "These women returning from the well with pitchers balanced on their heads seem to be thinking of nothing else but exchanging tidbits of gossip with each other. And yet they are all the time concentrating on something far more important, on balancing the pitchers on their heads. Thus, whatever your body, your senses, or the purely surface part of your mind may be occupied with, see that the root of your mind is constantly focused on God." Vaitag and Vairagya. If we look upon renunciation as being a state of mind, we can understand how this state of mind may be either temporary or permanent. The former is known as Vaitag and the latter as Vairagya. Vaitag, temporary renunciation, is simply a temporary disgust for the world and its affairs, resulting from some shock, disappointment, or loss, combined with a vague desire for God. Or it may come from a sudden impulse. In Vaitag, the mind turns away from the world and takes to godly ways. But this attitude is not lasting, and the mind returns to its old ways as soon as circumstances alter, or as soon as the impulse dies down. Vairagya, irrevocable renunciation, irrevocable renunciation, however, is an attitude of mind involving such a longing for God and such a deep indifference to things worldly that once roused, it knows no retreat and is proof against all temptations to give it up. The famous example of Gautama Buddha is illustrative of Vairagya. We have already explained that renunciation is the overt expression of a latent desire for union with God, combined with a latent spirit of disgust for the world. And we used an analogy of flower, pollen, and fruit. As far as fertilization is concerned, the flower and the pollen by themselves are helpless. For the two can only be brought together by some outside agency, such as the wind, the bee, or the insect. Whether or not fertilization takes place in nature may depend upon so many thousands of unknown factors that modern science gives up trying to predict it and labels it chance. That, however, is beside the point at the moment, and in our analogy, we shall think of this fertilization as a gift. To return to Vairagya, let us remember that the longing for union with God is latent in every living being. However, it only pushes its way into consciousness when the soul approaches the beginning of what Meher Baba, in the divine theme, calls the realization process. The disgust for the world is also something that develops naturally in all of us, and which grows more and more powerful as we draw nearer to the beginning of this realization process. When the flower is in full bloom and the pollen ripe, the wind or the bee gives the gift of fertilization that produces the fruit. In the same way also, when this moment of inner readiness comes, a divine gift descends upon the soul, which fertilizes the longing for God and the disgust or indifference for the world, and so brings about the priceless fruit of Vairagya. This divine gift may be a touch of inner grace from the indwelling God, or it may be the result of contact with a saint or a perfect master, but it is always a gift. Vairagya, when it first becomes manifest, will almost certainly express itself for a time as an external renunciation. But Vairagya, being permanent, will always lead sooner or later to the real renunciation, which is internal. When an aspirant has such an intense longing for truth, he is qualified to enter the path. There is the story of a master who was pestered by a disciple as to when he would realize God. Once, when they went to bathe in a river, the master held the aspirant underwater for a few moments. When the disciple was on the verge of suffocation, the master pulled him out and asked what he had thought of and longed for most while under the water. The aspirant replied, "Air." The master explained that when the disciple had just as intense a longing for God, then realization would come. Maulana Rumi says, Ab kamjo tishnigi avar bidast. In English, call out for water less, but create thirst for it more. In the words of Meher Baba, the path begins with a conscious longing for a deeper reality. As the fish, which is taken out of water, longs to go back to the water, so the aspirant who has sensed the goal longs to be united with God. Do we continue?
Yes, please.
Okay. In fact, the longing to go back to the source is present in each being from the very time that it gets separated from the source by the veil of ignorance. But it is unconscious till the aspirant enters the path. Just asterisk. Should we do that? Yeah. Oh, the asterisk says, see also Meher Baba, The Stages of the Path, Discourses, pages 128 to 134. The Sufis call this attitude of mind tauba, meaning repentance and implying the turning away from or renouncing of the life of the senses for the life of the spirit. One who has taken this great step does not look back again at that which he has left behind. Meher Baba says that there may be 1,000 seekers enjoying as many spiritual experiences, but there is only one path of gnosis. It is an internal, but an actual pathway. Though not an ordinary path, it is distinctly perceptible as such to the internal eye of the true pilgrim who travels along it. But even those mystics who have truly experienced can only explain the sections of the path that they themselves have traversed. Those who have reached the critical point on the third plane can know nothing about the fourth plane, nor can they lead anyone up to their own level. Their knowledge and experience are limited to themselves. Only those on the fifth and sixth planes can bring others up to their own level, and anyone upon whom their grace descends will be greatly benefited. The individual souls of the world are within the limits of the gross sphere, which includes all the gross suns, moons, worlds, and all space. A savage, ignorant of the most elementary scientific laws and of the code of right and wrong, and a great philosopher or scientist are both within the bounds of the gross sphere. The philosopher may be quite familiar in theory with the subtle sphere, and the scientist may be an authority on the extreme frontiers of modern physics. But from the standpoint of the subtle, they and the savage belong to the gross sphere. Until the subtle sphere is experienced, gnosis remains a subject for intellectual quibbling for all those belonging to the gross sphere, because by subtle, we do not mean merely the finest form of the gross. In the ordinary sense of the word, it may be correct to call very fine substances such as ether, the atom, vibration, light and space, subtle, but they are unquestionably gross, though in a very fine form. Spiritually speaking, subtle means something completely different from the physical, however attenuated physical things may be. Although the gross sphere is the outcome of the subtle sphere and is dependent on it, the subtle sphere is completely independent of the gross sphere. As an example, we may take the act of eating. The gross act is the outcome of the thought and depends upon it, but the thought is independent of the physical act. forgetfulness. The whole philosophy of approaching and realizing the truth hinges on the question of what we may call forgetfulness. The word forgetfulness used here must not be associated with its commonly accepted meaning of forgetting to post a letter or of a state of mind that is simply dull and blank. Forgetfulness in this special sense is an attitude of mind that develops gradually into spiritual experience. External renunciation is not forgetfulness because it is mostly physical and partly mental. But internal renunciation, when it becomes purely mental, does assume the quality and dignity of forgetfulness. Thus, one may renounce the world, but it is not so easy to forget it. Forgetfulness in this special sense thus explains the secret that lies behind all happiness, spiritual or otherwise, that human beings experience. The Sufi term for this forgetfulness is bikuti, and it should not be mixed up, though it often is, with behoshi, unconsciousness. The difference between forgetfulness and unconsciousness is important, and a few examples of types of unconsciousness will help to make it clear. To begin with, one must remember that forgetfulness is the partial or total detachment of the mind from the physical world, and unconsciousness, the partial or total deadening of the mind to the physical world. The former gives rise to various degrees of spiritual ecstasy, and the latter to various degrees of cessation of pleasure and pain. Let us then look at one or two examples of unconsciousness. In perfect health, one does not bother about the functioning of a vital organ like the heart. This means that one forgets that this organ is beating ceaselessly and perfectly in the human body for the maintenance of life and health. If, however, there is a disturbance in the cardiac rhythm, there is immediate discomfort. And if there is a cardiac infarct, there is immediate precordial pain. In either case, one is reminded that one has a heart. The sensation of discomfort or pain that arises from the heart is felt only because of the functioning of the mind. The more the mind is directed to the heart, the more the discomfort or pain is felt. When pain reaches its climax, unconsciousness may supervene, a break in the threads of consciousness that enables one to forget the pain. But this is unconsciousness and not forgetfulness in its spiritual sense. A surgeon, by performing a prefrontal leucotomy, can interfere with some of the nervous pathways that serve this focusing of the mind on the intractable pain of some incurable disease like cancer. After this operation, the pain is still there, but the patient ceases to direct his mind towards it, and so ceases to bother about it. This again is a partial unconsciousness brought about by purely physical means, and not true forgetfulness in its spiritual sense. Sleep is a state of unconsciousness that affords a temporary respite from the wear and tear of life. But sleep is not true forgetfulness in its spiritual sense. The whole philosophy of happiness and unhappiness, therefore, hinges on the question of forgetfulness of some kind or another, and of remembrance of some kind or another. Remembrance is an attachment of the mind to a particular idea, person, thing, or place. And forgetfulness is its opposite. Once it is understood that remembrance causes pain, it follows that the only cure is some kind of forgetfulness. And this forgetfulness may be either positive or negative. The positive forgetfulness is one in which the mind remains aware of external stimuli, but refuses to react to them. The negative forgetfulness is either mere unconsciousness, a stopping of the mind as in sound sleep, or an acceleration of it as in madness, which has been defined as a way of avoiding the memory of suffering. Either sleep or madness may be artificially induced in various degrees by the use of intoxicants or drugs, but this also is a negative way of overcoming remembrance.
Thanks, Marian. So we'll pick up here at the bottom of page 200 next time.
Okay. Wonderful. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank